Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to another episode of the Daily Friend Show. I am your host, Nicholas Lorimer, and today I'm joined by Sara. Sara, how are you doing?
Well, I'm sitting in lovely drizzly rain, which is
I know, me too,
really
in
neat.
Johannesburg is
Yeah.
absolutely lovely. And we're also joined by Mr. Michael Morris. Michael, how are you?
Fine, thank you indeed. Very sunny here, hot actually. No sign of rain. We could do with some rain, but enjoying the weather.
I've very much
all
had
the same.
enough of hot for this year.
I
After
can
the January we had this year. Anyway,
Mm.
right, so let us get into the news, and today is the State of the Nation Address Day, or SONA Day, as it comes to be known. And we're going to see our President Cyril Ramaphosa stand before the nation, well, not in Parliament, because Parliament has burned down, and no one seems in a particular hurry to fix that. There's going to be glitz and glam from politicians wearing clothing that they probably doesn't suit them that well, but it's very shiny and fancy. And there's going to be, I'm sure, some disruption from the EFF, who I think are planning, they say they're planning some kind of national shutdown on March 20th. And so I'm sure they will be using this opportunity to advertise to the world and to the nation that they are angry about something, presumably pala, but with the EFF it kind of changes every few minutes. And the president is going to give a speech in which he is no doubt going to talk about how terrible a state we're in, particularly when it comes to electricity, and then list off a whole bunch of nonsense which hasn't got much chance of becoming true. And the most depressing part for me of every SONA is when the number of people on social grants is announced and everyone in the ANC benches cheers as though this is a great achievement. So with that thoroughly gloomy picture painted, Michael, what do you make of what we're going to kind of get out of the SONA? It seems like this is an important one for Cyril, more important than it usually is. It's not his last SONA before the election. That'll be next year. But it does seem like what he says now is going to probably have a big impact on the ANC's fortunes, in the sense of, can he convince people that he's maybe trying to turn this thing around?
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, just the past day or so, certainly the past week, looking at the number of people who've been saying the sort of things we've been saying for a while, that the solution will ultimately depend, first of all, on the ANC being out of the picture. And one considers people like Jonathan Jansen and Zaki Ahmed, leading journalists who've been very pro Ramaphosa in the past. I think there's just been such a dramatic change. Also, I can't remember where.
Just to add to that point, while looking for stories to talk about today, the overwhelming tenor of all the headlines and opinion pieces on the State of the Nation address tonight is just grumpiness, fed upness, and cynicism.
Yeah. Enough of the empty promises. Get real. We want action, not just words. So this is really the expectation. I mean, that's, I would have thought, is quite a risk for Ramaphosa, because he needs to be able to at least tell the diehards that there really is hope for preserving the liberation movement, as people fondly remember it from ages ago, in which they know it isn't anymore. But is there any chance of resuscitating that sort of sense of what the ANC could be? And I think, as you say, tonight's performance will have quite a bearing on that, on whether he's going to have any hope of convincing people that, after all the load shedding, and apparently load shedding is the one thing, I can't remember where I read this, but one thing that has sort of cut through a lot of the sense of loyalty and so on. People are just simply not convinced. If you can't deliver power, to my TV, there's something seriously the matter. And this has been going on for so long, and there have been so many promises. We heard about it last SONA. Now it's time for action. Yeah.
As it turns out, the thing that really annoys South Africans, probably more than all of the other failures of government, is not having TV, not having tea,
Yeah.
You can't,
Yeah.
can't make things in your kettle.
Exactly.
And it's kind of funny. It's those very small, sort of intimate things, which I think speaks
Yeah.
to a little bit to our a lot of the depoliticization that's gone on in South African society.
Mm, mm,
Needed something that stretched so deeply into people's lives in order
yeah.
to get a lot of people into the game.
Mm,
I think I saw a figure that we're on we're close to 1,000 hours of load shedding so far this year.
yeah.
We haven't had a day without it so far.
Yeah.
So that's
Yeah.
going to hang over everything. Sara, two questions. Firstly, just your general thoughts on SONA and what we might get from Cyril, whether it might be anything interesting, whether he's going to be able to turn it into some kind of PR win. And secondly, firstly, rather might I add, the EFF. So I have no doubt that they're going to do some kind of spurious shouting at the Speaker of Parliament for the first maybe an hour and a half, as has happened in the past couple of SONAs for a while now. Do you think that gets them anything? I mean, what's interesting about polling across the country is that despite the ANC's fall, the EFF, it's picked up from them in some by-elections, sure, but on a national level, it really seems to kind of be in the same place that it always was. I mean, do you think it's time for them to change it up? Because it doesn't seem to be working politically anymore.
Well, I think I can't remember which polling survey I read. I feel like I'm reading everything on anything and can't remember anything. But basically said how fed up those polled, and they usually poll them demographically, of the antics of the EFF. So in other words, the older voter, and by that I don't mean old, I just mean older voter, is going to sit there and think, well, they're going to hate it. I'm going to hate it. I'm not going to watch it. Maybe with any luck, my lights will go out, so I can proffer a good excuse for not having watched it. Me and sort of 58 million other South Africans. But I think it's going to be the same. I mean, I think the only way Cyril can deal with something like the SONA is by talking a lot. And there's going to what usually happens is he greets everybody, and that takes about half an hour, and then he talks about the ills of the past, and then he comes back to some recognition of what's going wrong, but they're probably going to talk about the railways sort of concession to the private sector that only one company has taken up, but it's that sort of thing. It's a sort of, he goes so far as he can about privatization without using the word, because his cabinet are still stuck in, I think Michael mentioned East Berlin, or you mentioned East Berlin, or Soviet Russia, places that don't exist anymore. So they're out there in the nether reaches of nothing. But that's very strong. And given the fact that he is primarily the leader who wants to ensure that the ANC doesn't rupture, we can be sure that whatever he says that is good for us won't happen, as long as the ANC survives. So I look, I would be pleasantly surprised, but I think the problem is that having had load shedding, nothing he says about their new plans or their new committees or having a new CEO, whatever it might be, I don't think any of us are going to be convinced by anything. We're just going to, we're actually just biding our time till the election. So a year is not enough time for a very slow ANC to actually get something done, unless they do it with a barrel of a gun.
This is the sense I'm kind of getting from the ANC right now. So I do think that there's a genuine panic, and I think that there's a feeling that they need to come to some sort of other conclusion, and maybe even change some of the policies that they're so in love with. But not enough to actually change them, especially to the degree in which we're doing. And of course, not to touch the big ones like EWC, which they're still going ahead with full steam ahead. But you see this in kind of how this example you used, where and this is a story we thought about talking about on the show this week, but didn't have time to get to, is that government in some places has decided to lease a piece of railway to a private company. So basically, for the first time, there will be a non-state agency running a piece of South Africa's railway, which sounds like a great idea. That's definitely policy that I think I would endorse, and I'm sure most people do at the IRR would. But once again, you see this reluctance to actually do it in the way that it needs to be done, which is that I think the lease was only for 2 years. And they were expecting the private company to put in some massive amount of money. And it's the same thing we're seeing in the kind of energy sector. It's like, okay, we'll allow a little bit of private investment, but not too much. And also we have an unbundled ESCOM, and also this and also that. And it's all just mucking about on the edges because there's too much inertia to actually change the things. And I think that probably means that they're doomed.
Yeah.
Can I just comment on that 2-year lease thing? Almost no one would go for it, except for a company that uses trains all over Africa. So they've got the stock, they've got the rolling stock, and they'll provide it. So I don't think that the 2 years probably doesn't they can work with that. And they're probably the only people who can work with that. But what I had to smile at was the CEO said, we just need the government to keep up its side of the bargain by, sorting out the infrastructure. And I thought, well, that's a quick 2 years of nothing happening.
Yeah.
Michael, do you agree that the inertia is so strong that regardless of what actually necessarily the leadership of the ANC, the senior leadership might want, that the forces, the push from ideology from the lower ranks of the party, the push from, and when I say the lower ranks, I don't mean the people, I mean the sort of mid-level of the ANC. That they just actually can't change.
Yeah. There was that comment, I think, was it Neil Froneman just this week, perhaps last, talking about, I think, was it mining exploration or, clearing the hurdles to encourage investment. And he, I think it was him, and I think his comment was something along the lines of, we have meetings with individuals and they completely understand. But when the cabinet meets, when they're in their sort of collective comfort zone or whatever it is, presumably discomfort zone these days, they just cannot, that commitment or that understanding just doesn't translate into concerted action to make that shift from where they are to where they need to be. And I think that you're quite right. This sort of fiddling on the fringes, a 2-year concession on a rail line. I saw one of the rail companies, one of the companies who might have been very interested, said it's just impossible. We need at least 10 years to be guaranteed that we'd be able to turn a profit, make this thing work. 2 years is impossible for the kind of investment that we're required to put up just to get it back on stream, never mind to make it a going concern. We need at least 10. So it's just not a serious offer to the private sector. And until the ANC is serious enough, quickly enough, it's just not going to make the headway that it needs now for its own survival, I think. I think it's come down to that now. So yeah.
No, very definitely. All right, let's move on to our next story. And this is something we also wanted to cover yesterday, but didn't quite have time to. The trade union Solidarity seems to have won what is effectively a victory in the legal system, although there was no court case held. So I'm sure everyone on the show who's been listening for a while since the COVID days remembers back when the tourism ministry realized the entire industry was shut down due to the COVID restrictions, and that a lot of people in the tourism business needed some help. However, the minister decided that despite the fact that this was emergency relief aid for people whose businesses were legally not allowed to operate by law, that the aid was going to be handed out on the basis of race and not on need necessarily. So Solidarity took the Minister of Tourism to court over this, and they didn't win, I think, the initial court case. However, they then took it to the Supreme Court of Appeal, and the Supreme Court of Appeal found that actually, no, the minister can't just say emergency relief aid needs to be handed out on the basis of PE, which is what the minister said that the law required her to do. It wasn't even a choice. However, despite the fact that this is now largely a moot issue, considering the fact that COVID relief is, sort of an issue of the past, it wasn't being handed out anymore, the minister decided that this battle still needed to be fought in defense of BEE. And this is, I think, another thing that just shows the kind of the ideological inertia in the ANC is just the overwhelming desire, the need to defend BEE right until the death. And so they appealed the Supreme Court of Appeals decision, and it went before the Constitutional Court, who said, nah, this issue is no longer in effect. The Supreme Court of Appeals ruling stands, and we're just not going to discuss this. So effectively a win for Solidarity here. Their spokesperson said, if you look at the judgment from the front that the appellate court sets out clearly in a disaster situation in terms of the Disaster Management Act, you cannot use BEE criteria to allocate funds. So that's a judgment that stands at this point in time. Therefore, it's a precedent, and we will most certainly make use of it in future as well. Sara, what do you make of this story?
I think that's the value of it. I mean, essentially, the Constitutional Court throughout the application, basically application for leave to appeal was thrown out. So it was purely technical. They didn't grapple with the issue. But that, in a way, is an advantage, because you know that in the High Court, you're likely to stumble. You'll get the relief you want, most likely in the Supreme Court of Appeals. And then the Constitutional Court is uncertain, leaning towards sympathetic towards whatever the government's doing. But with the standing judgment being in the Supreme Court, that, you know, other people who want to challenge anything that related to BEE that's similar would go to the High Court, may or may not succeed, but they may succeed because they've got the Supreme Court precedent. But if not, they'll go to the Supreme Court. So that would take may take quite a long time, but the precedent is there. And that I think is important. It's these little victories, like a bit like the certificate of need in relation to doctors. You know, is likely to be a major stumbling block to the implementation of the NHI. So this is what these sort of victories are really about, and one has to give Solidarity credit for sticking it out. Just of interest, a little while ago, I read an article about the relief given to small businesses in America, and they did exactly the same thing. I don't know if they did it in terms of any law, or rather just they did it. It was part of their modus operandi and the philosophy with which they came to it. But that's interesting. I mean, it has sort of very much a woke resonance. Here it's woke, but it has a whole lot of other resonances. And I think it's there to be relied on, and for as long as we can, we should.
So, Michael, it does look like the legal system is kind of is getting less favorable to BEE. We've seen quite a few cases which seem to be setbacks for the state in regards to pushing race-based laws.
Yeah,
and of course, you see the problem is that their Chief Justice, who's at the head of the Apex Court, is the same person who chaired the Zondo Commission, which found that BEE as the main basis upon which contracts be awarded in the public sector is wrong.
Yeah,
right.
Yeah. Just this week, I think it was. Sorry.
No, go ahead, Michael.
No, I was just going to say in Gabriel Krause's statement on SONA, I think on Monday, he highlighted this very aspect of racial preferencing in procurement policy, and that Ramaphosa had an opportunity today to, as he put it, implement the Zondo Commission report's advice to, quote, maximize value for money by explicitly putting that priority above racial preferencing and localization in all state procurement. And he adds this telling detail that state procurement is now approaching 1 trillion rand a year. I mean, it's a huge amount of money. So a very, very significant investment in the economy, which is either going to be channeled potentially to the elite that is already rich and not really benefiting people very widely, or in fact assisting the economy very significantly. So yeah, I think it's a very important decision, and of course coming ahead of the expectation that we could well have a new declaration of disaster to deal with the Eskom issue. So it is a very useful thing to have on the books as it stands.
Yeah, I think that you're even beginning to see this from the more, the dishonest defenders of BEE are still sort of making the same arguments that they've always made and making up things. But I think the honest defenders are starting to immediately are starting to concede the point that this wasn't how it was supposed to be, and and are now kind of trying to say, well, we need to reform BEE in some way. Those suggestions are often underwhelming, but I think it's a sign that the public debate is actually beginning to move on this one.
Yeah.
Sara, any final thoughts?
Tangential, but I picked up, looking through social media, I picked up a brief video of Andre de Ruyter, I assume, addressing the Parliamentary Portfolio Committee on Energy, whatever. And he gave as an example, one of their due diligence discovered hundreds of millions of rands worth of contract, had gone to a man deeply in debt, who was, I think, under risk of having his house taken away, living in Mauritius part of the world, who had no ability to do whatever it is that he'd been given the contract for. You see, I think it's ultimately going to be that sort of stupid carelessness where I'll literally favor my buddy, the guy next door, and we'll see what we can work out between the two of us. I mean, obviously, it's horrendous that this has taken so long to come forward. But if you can withdraw 314 million rand, take it away from the guy who's losing his house or his car or both in Germiston, that's great. But one assumes there is just, again, so much more, much more craftily handled that we have to get to grips with. So there's certainly, whatever unit the government wants to give the authority to find the money, boy, it's out there somewhere if it hasn't already been spent.
Yeah, indeed. And your point, Nicholas, about the shift in public sentiment, I was very struck this week to happen to need to go somewhere. My car was in hospital, and I took an Uber drive, and there was a very pleasant young man from KwaZulu-Natal. And I was just chatting away and asked him how he found Cape Town. And he said, well, it's very pretty, but one of the main things is it's properly run. He said, where I come from, you've got a lovely city, it's pretty, it's nice people, but you've got the councillors where the money just goes into their pockets. So there is this. It's just such a common narrative now, commonly understood and accepted narrative that this thing is just not working. It's not seen as transformation. It's simply seen as venal theft and corruption.
Right, which is actually why when we spoke earlier this week about those poor polling results of the ANC, there's been a lot of criticism of that polling because of how badly it was reported on and how few details are about it. But the reason I find it believable is precisely because of these things you mentioned. All right, let's move on to our next one. I don't know how much there is to say about this one, but I think this is a very common problem in South Africa that just always needs to be sort of bashed on the head. The chairperson of the South African Local Government Association in KwaZulu-Natal has said that, the real problem, this was Tommy and Thuli, said the real problem with service delivery, particularly in rural areas, is that the funding model is wrong. You see, the problem is rural areas are just not getting enough money. They said, quote, depending on the population of the municipality, funding is not good. People migrate from rural areas to cities. Clearly, rural communities end up getting very little budget. And that if we just restructured the way that we allocated money, service delivery in rural areas would improve massively. Sorry, your thoughts.
Is he suggesting that, in fact, the model we create is, give 1,000 rand to each member of the community in the rural area under question and let them get on with it themselves, which, of course, is not entirely the silliest idea. I have no idea what he's
much more efficient. That would be more efficient than what we currently do.
I assume the model he's looking at is the model that directs money directly into his pocket, as opposed to perhaps going through a middleman. Models, that's the sort of thing that an ANC flunky would suggest. I don't think anyone's going to listen.
No, Michael, this is a recurring problem of people saying, "Oh, the problem is just not enough money," and not enough money is sometimes a problem, but it's not even in the top 10 of the world's biggest problems in South Africa.
No, 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 indeed not. I mean, I often think of education. We have one of the highest spends on education in the world, I think. It's something like 20% of our total capital budget or spending budget, budgetary expenditure, which is astonishingly high. It's certainly higher than most first world countries. And yet we have, the crisis in education that everyone's only too familiar with, and very, very poor outcomes. And I think back often to the late JKB's report of, I think, 2017 or 2018 on the top Gauteng schools in that year or the previous year. And he had a kind of deep dive look at, what was it that made these schools successful. A good few of them were no-fee schools in poor communities. And they were all things to do with the style of teaching, the character of the principal, the degree to which parents were involved. And often the schools were under-resourced. They didn't have libraries and laboratories and all the rest of it, but they had that commitment to doing things properly, getting the kids taught, having extra lessons where required. So yeah, and I think it's the same with local government. You just got to have right people in the right places doing their jobs.
Yeah, and I think that also applies the other direction too, where having money doesn't necessarily mean good things either. I can think of there are private schools with a lot of fields and amenities that probably have worse results than schools with not as many of those things.
Yeah.
All right. So yeah, let's stop talking about there not being enough money and start talking about how we can spend the money better, especially when it comes to Eskom, because I think that's the most infuriating when people say, "Oh, the problem is we don't have enough money to Eskom." It's like, yes, but also. Right. So there was a report that came out recently which said that in last year there were at least sort of 86 strikes held in South Africa, which is quite a drop from previous years. I think there were 165 in 2018 and 157 in 2019 and 117 in 2020. And that most of these strikes were held about either making temp workers permanent workers or increasing wages or being upset about unpaid wages or something like that. What was interesting, though, is that the vast majority of these strikes were by people in the public sector, and also that a very large percentage of them were illegal strikes. 48 of the strikes identified by the study were protected, whereas 38% were illegal wildcat strikes. Sara, what do you make of this?
Yeah, I mean, the decrease in strikes and the fact that most strikes do occur in the public sector make absolute sense in terms of the economic conditions. The private sector, the people in the private sector, members of unions, know that things are so bad that however bad they are for them, their prime concern right now is just a company surviving, which provides their jobs. The public sector, however, is in a different place because and that's why they go on wildcat strikes, is often the unions, in fact, are trying, in fact, to control the situation and not make irrational demands. But because they know that it's public money that pays them and they get very largely, they've had inflation-linked increases, they go ahead in these ugly, violent, unprotected strikes. And then the unions, so the unions have really come up from behind. But then I'm not sure they help very much after that. So that's essentially, it explains the difference. And as, when you're in a very bad situation as we are, even as the public sector, you shouldn't be in a position where you can assume your job will not be affected, but it won't, because redeployment is the modus operandi in the public sector, can't be in the private sector, and it's seen literally by the figures that you gave.
Any final thoughts, Michael, before we close up for today?
It's just very interesting that point, the difference between private and public, and also one has the sense that that this in fact adds to what must be the kind of residual anxiety in the consciousness of the ANC, that the unions are not anymore the kind of foot soldiers against capitalism. They are understanding exactly where the money comes from and how tight it is and how important jobs are. And I would imagine that distilling through the organization must be quite an alarming thing for some in the ANC who would much prefer to have a nice ideological, nostalgic sort of fight on their hands. And it just isn't there because people understand that that's not the issue.
100%. All right. Thank you very much, everyone. We're going to close up for today. I hope that you found the show interesting, and we will see you next week, Monday, on the Daily Friend Show. Hope you all have a wonderful weekend. Cheers, everyone.